Today's episode is brought to you by Lamp Rainerson. Lamp Rainerson provides landscape architecture, planning, and civil engineering services. From community-wide master plans to land development, Lamp Rainerson incorporates sustainable design principles and equity in all of our projects.
Before we dive into this episode, we wanted to remind our listeners of the contest we launched to wrap up our first year of episodes. We want to showcase the up-and-coming ideas in the world of planning and design that will hopefully gain traction and make their way back onto our podcast as a book review episode. Are you going to be the person who comes up with a groundbreaking idea like new urbanism or form-based code? For more information on the contest, deadlines, and the prizes in the two categories, student and practicing professional, head to www.bookedonplanning.com/contest. This is Booked on Planning, a bi-weekly podcast that breaks down the world we live in by paging through current and classic books. I'm Steph Rouse, and my co-host for this episode is Paul Barnes. This week, we're joined by Donald Shoup, author of The High Cost of Free Parking. Donald is a distinguished research professor in the Department of Urban Planning at the University of California, Los Angeles. His research has focused on how parking policies affect cities, the economy, and the environment. Shoup is a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners and an honorary professor at the Beijing Transportation Research Center. Thanks for joining us for this episode, Don. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and why you decided to write this book?
Well, thanks for inviting me. I don't know why I started writing this book. I suppose I backed in, like most research on parking, that I teach an economics course. I did teach an economics course for urban planners, which most planners have to take, for 30 years. And it turned out that parking was one of the best things to explain to urban planners as to how economics can help you make better decisions. Because I think that planners have made the wrong decisions about parking and many other things for a long time. And the way I explained it to the students, suppose you had been asked by Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller in 1900 as to what planners could do to increase the demand for gasoline and cars. And I say, well, think of these three policies. One is to separate land uses so that housing here, jobs there, shopping someplace else. So you have to travel from one zone to another in a day, and you would go to work, then you would shop all the way home, and then come back home, and you park free everywhere. And second is to limit density so that there won't be too much activity on any site. Buildings may be no more than 3 stories tall, or cover more than half of the land. And third, require ample off-street parking everywhere. Now, that is essentially what urban planners have done. And I don't think they meant to do it to increase the demand for cars and fuel, but it does. So I think that it's hard to reform zoning, and you've had a podcast on zoning. But parking is somewhat different. I listened to Sonia Hertz's podcast on zoning, and she said what many people think of zoning is that it tells you the use you can make on the land and how much you can have of it, single family or multifamily, commercial. And there's a limit on how much you can do, how many square feet. So zoning tells you what you can and you can't do. But parking requirements are the third part of zoning. They came into practice certainly in the 40s and then really spread very fast in the 50s. And they're different from the first two, the regulations on use or on density, because they don't just tell you what you can and you can't do. They tell you what you must do. You must provide this many parking spaces for whatever you're doing. And so that adds a cost to whatever you're planning. And that cost gets built into the cost of housing or shopping or employment, everything, because they have to have all these parking spaces. And that cost is shifted into the price of housing and the price of everything. everything except parking. So we have a policy that makes parking free, but everything else more expensive. And of course, many planners, they want to have walkable neighborhoods. They want to have cheaper housing. They want maybe allow more density. But parking requirements get in the way of all of the planner's goals. Just anything a planner wants to do. The first thing they learn about in any project in an urban planning course is the parking makes everything difficult. It makes it expensive. It makes the project not work out. And of course, there's the longer run problem, and it makes so much of the city covered with parking. So I think parking is a great way for economists to explain to planners why you should charge for things, at least for things that you don't want to have more of. That if you want less traffic, if you want less air pollution, if you want less carbon emissions, if you want lower housing costs and things like that, you shouldn't require parking for everything. And so I think that parking is one of these parts of our economy where it's way underpriced. The price that drivers pay is far below the cost of providing the parking. So if I have any method in teaching, is to look at areas where the price is far lower than the cost to the user, and you don't want more of it. So I think planners have made terrific mistakes in planning for parking, and it's very easy to remedy them. There are a lot of things that we realize that we've done wrong, but it's hard to remedy them. But removing parking requirements is easy. It doesn't cost anything, and it has a lot of benefits. So when I worked on the book is say, how do you make this politically possible? Because charging for parking is hard to persuade drivers to pay for it when almost everybody is a driver. So that was the theme of the book, why parking has been mishandled by urban planners and how you can reach a new regime where the main reform is to charge the right price for curb parking. And I think if you want to summarize an 800-page book in 3 bullet points, it's charge the right price for curb parking, by which I mean the lowest price the city can charge and still have 1 or 2 vacant spaces on every block, and then spend the revenue on neighborhood public services on the metered streets. So the money that's put into a parking meters come right out the other side and repairs sidewalks or cleans sidewalks or plants street trees, or some cities give free Wi-Fi to everybody on the block or free transit passes to everybody on the block. So the people on the block see that they want to charge for curb parking. No one wants to pay for curb parking. But if you spend the meter revenue to provide added public services on the metered blocks, then the residents can see, well, yes, it's like putting a cash register out on the curb for our services. And then the third policy is to remove off-street parking requirements, because if there's always on-street parking available, how can you say that planners should require off-street parking for everything?
That's great, Don. Thank you for that introduction and overview. We do have some specific questions here that I'm going to dive into, and I think it picks up well because you've touched on the 3 policies in the book. And the first of those 3 policies states, set the right price for curb parking. Cities across the country have different demographics, different politics, but how do you see that this specific policy can be accomplished across the country?
Technically, it's very easy. It wasn't in the beginning. The first parking meter installed in the world was in Oklahoma City in 1935. And most cities' parking meters are identical to the 1935 model. As you put your money in and you hope you get back before your time runs out. Can you think of anything else that payment has remained static for so long? Now we have credit cards and debit cards and PayPal, and there are many ways to pay for parking. And now the parking meters, they're far better. They can take credit cards. They can give you instructions in any language. They can charge you for exactly the amount of time you should pay for. And then the newer ones, they don't even use parking meters at all. You pay simply by your license plate and your cell phone when you pull up to the curb. The cell phone knows where it is and it knows your license plate number and say, I'm going to start paying for parking. And then when they enforce it, the cities enforce it by having license plate recognition cars that drive around and looking to see, has this license plate paid for parking? So I think that it's very easy and very cheap to charge for curb parking. And you can charge different prices at different times. That if the peak demand for park is in the afternoon, the price would be higher in the afternoon. If there's not much demand at night, it'll be free. Whenever you could charge nothing and have plenty of open spaces, the right price is zero. But the right price depends on the time and the location. So cities can charge different prices at different times and different locations. And the user with their cell phone pays most of the infrastructure costs. And the city doesn't do this. They contract with pay-by-cell phone companies who handle it all. So I think we could do much more with curb parking than we used to be. It's not too cheap to meter. And I think with this license plate recognition system, cities, like yours or like anybody's, they can charge a lower price for residents than for non-residents. Say in Miami Beach, which has a lot of non-residents there, want to park, residents pay $1 an hour and non-residents pay $4 an hour. And the non-residents don't know that the residents are paying $1 an hour. So you can make it politically possible. It's like, a hotel tax or what like Monty Python called taxing foreigners living abroad. So I think that it's now very easy for cities to charge the right price for curb parking. It's been happening. Other cities have done it, big and small. So I think that you just have to make it popular, I think, by spending the money on what the neighborhood wants.
Some of this, Don, that you've touched on is related to the topic of performance-priced parking systems. And I'm kind of intrigued about the idea of out-of-towners paying a different price. And I think here in Lincoln, that may be something to consider since we're a capital city and we have, home of the Cornhuskers football team with lots of out-of-town visitors. So definitely something to think about. But specific to performance-priced parking systems, I guess, is there anything else that a city like Lincoln should take a look at or be aware of if we do take on that kind of model?
Any city, any university town that has a popular football team is going to have huge spikes in demand. And San Francisco is the first city that went whole hog on charging prices by time of day and by location. And the minimum price they charge is 25 cents an hour, and the maximum is $6 an hour. And they only change prices once every 3 months. So they look what happened in the previous 3 months to see whether the spaces are overoccupied or underoccupied in every location, and they adjust the price. They adjusted the price just by 25 cents an hour. So if the prices started out at either $2 or $3 an hour in San Francisco, and it took about 3 years before some of the prices to get down to 25 cents an hour because it only went down slowly. And 17% of all curb parking spaces went down to 25 cents an hour at some time of the day. And only 17%, I think, ever reached the maximum. They have a special event charge for football games or any big event. The price can go up to $18 an hour at the curb. And I asked, well, how did you get $18 an hour? They said, well, that's what the off-street operators charge. If we're going to try to stop people driving around hunting for parking, we should act like an off-street parking garage. Some cities do charge a very high price for curb parking during the game day. And what they do in Washington, D.C., they charge a low price before and after the game, but a high price during the game. So they want people to come in early and eat at a restaurant or stay later and eat at a restaurant, or not everybody come at the last minute, but they limit the number of people actually wanting to park during the game by charging a high price during the game hour. And many universities, you could see it. That probably happens in Lincoln, that on the big game days, the people who live near the stadium sell parking in their driveways or on their front yards. Does that happen in Lincoln?
It sure does.
So if people know they're getting the money, they understand what the right price for curb parking is. It's only when it's a political choice and everybody wants to park free that a city, can't raise the price in response to high demand. I would think of charging for curb parking during big events in Lincoln and any other city with a high price at the time of the highest demand. And it could go $5, $6, $7, $8, $9 an hour. If that's what it takes, it should be what the traffic will bear, I suppose. The way I define the right price for curb parking is the lowest price the city could charge and still have one or two vacant spaces. Can you think of a better way to set the price for curb parking? Whenever I'm interviewed, I say, well, how else would you do it? Instead, planners have just ignored it. I mean, most people have ignored curb parking because transportation planners ignore curb parking because nothing is moving. And urban planners ignore curb parking because it's in the roadway. So it was just left out in the rain for 100 years.
So wrapping up the first policy and talking about performance price parking, what are we really trying to accomplish with this policy in summary here?
It's not to discourage driving a car. It's to manage the curb parking properly so that whenever you get to your destination, there will be an open space right on the block where you want to park. That's the purpose. It's not to get people out of their cars, although that might happen. But it would dedicate the parking spaces to people who really want to park there. As a jumping ahead about parking benefit districts to make these demand-based prices popular. The first city that really went whole hog on parking benefit districts was Pasadena, California. An old town, like many cities do, that there were wonderful buildings in terrible condition. It had started out as a very upscale shopping center in the 1920s and earlier. But then it declined in the Depression, the World War II, and then it didn't have much parking. And after World War II, the suburban malls stole their customers away. The merchants, they parked their cars on the street. There was a 2-hour time limit. They parked their cars on the street and moved them every 2 hours. And then they claimed that there wasn't enough parking for their customers. City wanted to put in parking meters. And the merchants and the landowners and the residents had no way until finally the city said, if we put in the parking meters, we'll spend all the money to rebuild all your sidewalks, restore all your alleys as pedestrian lanes, and plant new street trees. And the merchants, everybody said, well, that's different. Why didn't you tell us that? Let's run the meters till midnight. Let's run them on Sunday. Let's charge a high price, because they knew they were going to get what they wanted. It had been a commercial skid row for decades. After they put in the parking meters and they borrowed again, you could borrow money against parking meter revenue. They rebuilt all of the sidewalks and recovered all of the alleys, about $5 million. And they still had $700,000 a year after that debt payment to pay for all the extra services. That the sales tax revenue, which is a measure of business activity, tripled in the next 5 years. So many people say, well, charging for parking will chase away customers. Well, then why do the sales tax revenues triple? And now it's one of the most popular places to go in Southern California. 30,000 people on an average weekend come to walk around because it's such a beautiful place. It's kept absolutely immaculately clean. So I think that if you get the right price, it's simply the price that makes curb spaces available to anybody who's willing to pay. There are still skeptics. I was speaking in Santa Rosa, really nice old town, a bit like Pasadena in Northern California, and with all the same problems. And I had dinner the previous evening with the mayor and the council members, and I thought they all bought into the idea. And I spoke to a very large auditorium, maybe 200 people. And I gave the talk that I'm giving you. And at the end of it, a guy in the highest row over on the left, he jumped out of his seat and said, if this city begins charging for parking in the evening, I will never come downtown to a restaurant again. And, a council member or a mayor can't tell the guy he's nuts but a professor is a loose cannon. And I said, well, if the city charges for curb parking and you don't come downtown, the space you would have taken is available to somebody who is willing to pay for parking. And who do you think will leave a bigger tip at a restaurant? Somebody who's willing to come only if they could park free after driving around for 20 minutes, or somebody who's willing to come there so they can get a space right in front of the restaurant and pay for dinner. And then I said, and if you don't come downtown, maybe you'll get a better deal in the food hall of a suburban mall. And the whole audience, 200 people, they jumped to their feet and clapped and laughed. And see, I think that the people who speak in public meetings are the people who don't want to pay for curb parking. If it's a meeting about parking, if I'm coming, most of the people who ever heard of me realize I'm no friend of free curb parking. And so the green people, or the Greens, are usually the people who invite me. They think I'm an enemy of the car, which I'm not. I'm an enemy of parking subsidies. Cars are wonderful. It's just that we way overuse them because of urban planning. So I think that the segue from charging for parking to paying for public services with the meter revenue will get those 200 people, clapping and laughing and standing up. But I was really mistaken in how quickly that would work out. It was only 6 years later it took them to raise the price to start charging for parking in the evening. Things are very slow, because as you know, as urban planners, you have to have a lot of public meetings and reports and environmental impact reports and things like that. There are lots of ways to stall anything. Anyway, they started charging different prices in different parts of the town and charging in the evening. And that's a small town. I'm talking about places like Lincoln. Some people think I'm only talking about San Francisco and Los Angeles and Houston. No, a lot of small cities have done wonderful things. Fayetteville, Arkansas was a leader in removing off-street parking requirements. What happened afterwards is something that I certainly predicted. A lot of older buildings that had not been able to open up as restaurants because they didn't have the required parking suddenly became restaurants. A lot of wonderful old buildings, the kind we like, were not usable because of parking requirements.
Well, I do have a related question to this, kind of moving on. It's the second policy that you discuss in the book, and that's using the parking revenue to pay for community services. Does that assume that the cities are implementing a performance-priced system? I guess what I'm trying to get at is that assuming that these parking enterprises are really turning a profit and then therefore able to pay for these other improvements within the district?
Well, the answer to the first question is no. You could just put in parking meters. That does a lot of the work. They ensure turnover and they allocate the spaces to people who are willing to pay for parking. And nobody will park all day for free. So I think regular priced parking meters, conventionally priced parking meters, will suit a parking benefit district. Say in Pasadena, they don't have dynamic pricing. Other cities do, but Pasadena just charges the same price. So the answer is you could do it with conventional parking meters with doing nothing except dedicating the revenue to public services in the metered area. Now, the second one, just charging for curb parking yield any revenue. Well, I think it does in Lincoln, Nebraska. Don't you think the parking meters make money? Well, how many parking meters do you have?
I don't know the answer, Don.
Okay, well, see, people haven't thought about parking. People simply haven't thought about it. I think, and it isn't just you. It's just about everybody else, except for the Shoupistas, who often won't talk about anything else. But I think that, yes, the revenue will come in, and especially as soon as the people know that it's paying for what they want, and maybe they want more of it. Say in Boulder, Colorado, that's another university town that they have meters in the downtown area, and all the revenue goes to pay for transit passes for everybody who works or lives in downtown. So I think, so many people have just not thought about parking, especially in academia. What professor would spend a lot of time researching about parking?
I do have another question about the curb space here. And I'm wondering, as we're in this era of shared services such as Uber and Lyft, for example, how should those types of uses be regulated when using curb space? Also related to that would be loading and unloading zones for businesses in the district. How do you see those types of uses being regulated within a performance price parking system?
Well, I think that's the most important question nowadays. That cities have always had loading zones, but in most cities, they haven't changed them in the past 30 years. Now there is Uber and Lyft and Amazon, and there's so much more demand for loading zones than there used to be. And the loading zones, of course, are always free. So I think that if we start charging the right prices for curb parking, we should expand the loading zones and charge for them. A few cities are trying this now. That loading usually doesn't take very long, so it's maybe 5 minutes. So you need a micropayment. License plate recognition is the way to do this. They charge a much higher price than you would expect. Curb parking, say, it could be 10 cents a minute. So that's $6 an hour. But if you're only going to use 5 minutes, that's 50 cents. It's not much. So these micro payments, they generate more revenue in total. And you have to have a substantial vacancy rate because loading zones often look empty as nobody's using it. Why can't I park there? Other than you find illegal parking there. But the loading zones and the Uber and Lyft zones have to have higher prices and a higher vacancy rate, because there's going to be increases in demand that are hard to predict. And one of my students was a Lyft driver, and he studied curb parking for shared vehicles, TNC vehicles in West Hollywood. And it turned out that because the curb parking was underpriced and the spaces were always full, that on average, at about 36 minutes out of every hour had an Uber or a Lyft double parked in the lane. Getting in and out of a Uber or Lyft in the traffic is not the best way to handle it. You have to do it if all the curb spaces are occupied. And it slowed down traffic, of course. A double parked car, even if it's letting passengers in or out, that's just like another double parked car. So it reduced the traffic capacity of the rest of the streets. And it's dangerous. So I think that if you started charging for parking, you would realize that delivery vehicles, not just Uber and Lyft, but packages and things like that, that they would be willing and able to pay a high price for curb parking because their time is very valuable. That there's a driver to pay for, there's all the stuff in the truck. There was a study in Seattle riding around with Amazon drivers or delivery drivers, and they found that of an 8-hour day, an hour and 15 minutes were spent cruising for parking. So it would make the whole system work better if we had vacancies at the curb for whoever wants to use it. And it doesn't have to be parking. What we've learned in COVID is it can be used for outdoor dining. That one of the most popular programs in LA is converting curb parking spaces into restaurants. And just think of how many more people are employed in a curb space restaurant than an empty car would, and how much more sales taxes it pays, and how many more people it satisfies. That I think that we ought to think of other uses other than parking. What about bus lane? If you have a bus lane, it saves a lot of people a small amount of time. It speeds up the buses, which saves people's time. It reduces the bus company's costs because the buses are going faster. It makes them more reliable. You can compare it to the money you would get from curb parking spaces. I had a lot of experience with planning in LA, and anytime that they talk about converting a parking lane into a bus lane, is people, what about our precious parking? That precious parking that is free. So I think if you put a price on it, you will see that a bus lane is a far more valuable use of the curb lane than empty cars. Getting to shared cars, a different like Zip car, it could be that it may very well be in denser areas, not in Lincoln maybe, but in very dense areas, that the best use of the curb lane is for Zip cars. so that it will provide mobility for people who don't own a car, whenever occasionally they use it. So that a zip car would probably be willing to pay much more for a curb space than a private owner would to store their car overnight. So I think the more you use economics, let's put it that way, this is land we're talking about, so we should use land economics and say what is the highest and best use of the curb lane. And often it will not be parking in a dense area.
The next question here, Don, compares kind of downtown districts to suburban shopping and entertainment centers. And in cities with maybe struggling downtown districts that are in disrepair, maybe a lot of vacancies, how would a performance parking system in that kind of urban area help achieve what we're talking about here if they're competing with the suburban shopping and entertainment areas?
Well, I talked to you about Pasadena, which was an old downtown, which was struggling, that everything above the ground floor was empty. And even some of the ground floor stores were empty because it was so hard to find curb parking. Whenever you drove there, for one, it was dirty. The sidewalks were cracked and the street trees were dead or dying. And whenever you drove there, all the curb spaces were occupied. So who would want to go there? Why cruise around in Pasadena hoping to see a car moving out when you could 5 minutes later, you'd be at a mall and could park free. So old towns, they can't compete like with a suburban mall by copying it. They can take advantage of what they already have. They have historic architecture. They have walkable areas. They've got density. What they don't have is a lot of parking. So they ought to make the best use of their parking. So I would say, in answer to your question, I'd say, well, just listen to the first part of the broadcast about what Pasadena did.
Going on to the third policy in the book, which states remove minimum parking requirements. In Lincoln, our downtown district does not have parking requirements, but in downtown, the city provides public parking garages, parking lots, and of course, there's curb parking that's metered. If Lincoln were to remove parking requirements citywide, is there some sort of conversation needed about then the city providing these other types of public facilities as we do downtown?
Many cities have public parking. It's often wildly mismanaged. But San Francisco is a good case where they started charging the right price for curb parking. They have a website. You could go look on the website and see what the price of curb parking is everywhere. They also included 17 public garages in the system. And they just said, we're going to lower the price when there are a lot of empty spaces, and we're going to raise the price when there are no empty spaces. And this seemed like just astonishing. It's what all private operators do. With the private operators, what they say is, how do you price private? Well, you look at your competition. If their spaces are full and yours are empty, you should lower your price. If you look around and their spaces are empty and yours are full, you should raise your price. So what San Francisco did is that with the off-street parking, they did exactly what they did with on-street parking. And the prices in many of the garages dropped dramatically because there are times of day when there are a lot of empty spaces and they never even counted them. They never even tried to count the number of empty spaces. Now, what kind of business is that? If there are empty spaces in your garage, a lot of them, the price is too high. It's wasting the garage, and it's not providing customers for the stores, it's not or the restaurants or anything else like that. So you should lower the price of park in the public parking garages. What does Lincoln do? How do they price their off-street parking garages?
Well, we have shopper zones. So there's in all the public garages, the first half of the ramp, the first level is dedicated to free 3-hour parking. Because I think our problem is no one wants to go into the garages. They just want to park on the street and they won't spend the time to get into the garage. And
well, that happened in Pasadena. They built off-street parking garages and the first 2 hours were free and you had to pay after that. But the curb parking was free. And so the new parking garages never got anywhere near full, and people were driving around and around hunting for curb parking. So I think you should get the price of all parking right. And I think off-street parking requirements get it all wrong. You went to planning school. Did you learn how to set a parking requirement?
No.
Of course not. And did you realize that there were any projects that parking requirements would obstruct whatever you were hoping cities would be?
Nope.
Well, I think that parking requirements were an epic mistake by urban planners. But it isn't though we imposed an unpopular system on unwilling people, that everybody wants to park free. And planners were simply giving people what they wanted. But the cost was being hidden from drivers. Therefore, we had to have low density, because if you had high density and no off-street parking requirements, it would flood the street with cars. So I think all of our planning has really been planning for cars and not planning for people. I think that most people are not upset by higher density if the people came without a car. But if they do come without a car, we don't want them nearby. In our planning, we ensure that they do come with a car, because every house has to have 2 off-street parking spaces, for example. That guarantees that the people will have a car, because you've already paid for the house. The parking doesn't cost you anything. So I think that we've made epic mistakes in urban planning. And I listened to one of your earlier podcasts by Charles Barone. He was saying that the transportation engineers have made huge mistakes. When it comes to parking, I'm a Protestant, and I think that urban planning needs a reformation in its handling parking. And we've done it before. Urban renewal was the way to save cities, which is tear down large parts of the old part of town and rebuild it. That was recognized in retrospect as a horrific mistake. And so now we want to have historic preservation and scattered site public housing. And we thought that high-rise public housing was going to be the solution. Look what Chicago did, and St. Louis and other places. Now we realize that that was a horrific mistake. They're being torn down, and we want scattered site public housing. So planners often make a U-turn so fast that young people don't even know we were going in a different direction not long ago. And I hope that the same will be with planning for parking. Of course, it depends on young people, but I think that because they say in science, science marches on funeral by funeral. I'm not really going to convince many older people that they've been making mistakes all their life. But I think younger people, were not committed to the paradigm of off-street parking requirements and free curb parking. You can think differently.
I just have a couple more questions for us in this interview. This one's switching gears just slightly, but looking at neighborhood or resident parking programs, I'm wondering if you have some criteria in mind of where those types of programs are successful or needed, and what would be some pros and cons of that type of a parking system?
Well, I think Columbus, Ohio has the best example of that. They have an older area, the Short North District and the commercial district and single-family housing around it. And the conventional solution to this, which almost every city has, is permit parking programs. So the residents get a permit to park, and outsiders can park for 1 or 2 hours, or maybe even not at all. And it's hard to enforce that. Most people will risk parking for 3 hours in a 2-hour permit parking zone. But what Columbus, Ohio did is that they started charging market prices for curb parking in the commercial district, and they have a permit district. But they allow non-residents to park if they pay by cell phone. And they have different prices, different locations. So they look at blocks where the spaces are not all occupied. And in permit district, half or more of the spaces are empty because the people who live there, they have to go to work to pay for the mortgage. And they're not parking on their street. So to make use of this space for the commercial areas, they either allow the workers in the commercial area to buy permits to park in the permit district, but never on blocks that are normally full, and they allow non-residents to pay by the hour with a cell phone. So I think that is the next step in permit parking districts, is to charge outsiders and spend the revenue to fix your sidewalks or plant your street trees or whatever the neighborhood wants. Say with a regular permit parking zone, you get nothing except that you exclude non-residents.
In Lincoln, we've thought about eliminating parking requirements in certain districts across the city. And one of the things that we've been sensitive to is, if a commercial district is within a residential neighborhood, and we remove those commercial parking requirements, What about the overflow then into those adjacent residential areas? Do you think in that context, I guess, would that be kind of an area where a resident parking program would be successful?
Definitely. Even the old-fashioned parking program would be successful. I mean, how could it not be? Except that better version, permit parking zone 2.0 would say that if there's empty spaces, the non-residents can pay for parking in this area, and we will spend all of the revenue to improve the residential neighborhood. You don't have permit parking zones yet?
We do not have neighborhood or resident parking zones today.
Well, they're all over the country. I mean, you're not a pioneer if you have that, but you could jump over the old-fashioned one and to the 2.0 and say, yes, but we will allow non-resident buy-in where there are empty spaces.
Okay. The book talks about where parking requirements may have been reduced to incentivize redevelopment or to preserve historic properties. In terms of the whole conversation here, it seems that there's maybe times when a parking reduction is the way to go versus, a complete removal. What's the differentiation there? What kind of content can you add to that conversation?
Well, the differentiation is that urban planners have no technical ability to set a parking requirement. I mean, how many parking spaces should a restaurant have? The average for the United States is 10 spaces per 1,000 square feet. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the parking requirement in Lincoln, but that's 3 times the size for parking as for the restaurant. How did planners know that was right? How do you know that the parking requirement is right? Even if you reduce it, how would you know what the lower value would be? You'd have to fake it just the way planners have been faking it with a pretense that they know how many parking spaces to require. It's better to say we're going to get rid of them because then you don't have to claim anything. Say Buffalo, when it got rid of its parking requirements entirely, the average number of spaces in new developments declined just by 17%. A couple of projects provided no parking, and that was for affordable housing that wouldn't have been feasible otherwise. Some businesses provided more than previously required, but some provided less. So I would say I would let prices decide how many parking spaces there should be. I am sure in Lincoln, as well as other cities, you find you've got too much space devoted to parking.
That comment made me think of the interview you already mentioned with Charles Marone. In that conversation, he was equating TDMs to voodoo science. And that just made me think of parking requirements is kind of like voodoo science. We really just put some numbers to paper and there isn't a whole lot of actual science behind it. But
no, I think the profession has made a terrible mistake. It'll be recognized later on, I think. But I think the upside of this is that we have so many improvements that are possible. Somebody explained to me that reforming parking requirements in the United States would be like the Netherlands reclaiming underwater soil, that reclaiming land. We could reclaim so much land in the United States from parking, just as the Dutch reclaimed it from the sea. So that's the upside. We have a lot of land available right where we want housing. And if we don't have parking requirements, we'll get it.
I think that's a great way to wrap up this episode. And I just wanted to say thank you, Don, for coming on this show and talking with us about the high cost of free parking.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me.